to the chat for people who might be interested. And okay, let's get started then. Welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here being interested in our event on latecomer development in a global green economy. I'm Tilman Altenberg. I'm a researcher at the German Development Institute and in charge of the programs on economic and social transformation there. And this online seminar presents experiences from latecomer firms and countries taking advantage of the green techno-economic paradigm change. That's what the session is about. I would like to point out that this event is being recorded and that recording will be made publicly available online. The participants of this roundtable are editors of two very recent special issues of two very good academic journals exploring this topic. One is the special issue or special section, Green Windows of Opportunity, Latecomer Development in the Age of Transformation Towards Sustainability, edited by Rasmus Lehmer, Chaolan Fu, and Roberta Rabelotti, who are all here around the table. That's a set of 7 papers, I think, in the journal Industrial and Corporate Change. And the other special issue is in World Development. It's called Latecomer Development in a Greening World, edited by Anna Pegels and myself. And that's a set of 12 papers in principle. One is still in the review loop. The others are all accepted by now. And you can find the links copied in the chat. So today is a discussion among the guest editors of these two special issues with the aim of presenting research highlights and discuss to what extent both sets of research papers coincide in their main findings, or where we find different viewpoints or different evidence, and which open issues remain also for further research. So let me briefly introduce the speakers. We have Professor Chaolan Fu. She's the founding director of the Technology and Management Center for Development and Professor of Technology and International Development at University of Oxford. We have Rasmus Lehmer as an associate professor at Aalborg University Business School. We have Anna Pegels, my colleague and senior researcher at the German Development Institute, and Roberta Rabelotti, professor of economics at the University of Pavia in Italy. Both special issues have the same starting point. The green transformation and the related techno-economic paradigm changes across institutional market and technological domains are opening windows of opportunity, particularly or also for emerging economies to achieve leadership in new sustainability related industries. So underlying is the idea of a techno-economic paradigm change, which means that it's not just incremental change of some technologies or some sectors, but it is cross-sectoral deep transformation that devalues many assets of incumbents and thereby provides opportunities for newcomers to move into the newly emerging markets. So clearly such a paradigm change, if you accept our starting proposition that we are dealing with a paradigm change here, changes the situation for latecomers. It creates opportunities, of course, because incumbents are many of the assets of incumbents are being devalued. So new people can come in that provides opportunities to catch up, to maybe even leapfrog ahead in new industries. That's what one of our teams called the green windows of opportunities. But of course, this also requires capabilities. I mean, the incumbents may have much larger budgets and capabilities to take the lead again. So it's really an empirical question to what extent this possibility of moving into the free spaces freed up by the paradigm change are being taken. And the two special issues now have taken stock of the debate. We present a number of brand new case studies, I think almost 20 in total, covering a wide range of technological sectors, extracting general lessons and thereby contributing to better understanding of the opportunity associated with greening of economies, and hopefully informing policymakers in search of the right coping strategies. One of the special issues focusing entirely on China, because China is, of course, a very special case and moving forward very quickly in many green areas. That's the industrial corporate change special issue. And it's focusing also on energy-related industries, whereas the world development special issue is covering a wider range of cases from all sorts of countries and all sorts of sectors. So we're not duplicating efforts, but I think they hopefully speak to each other very well. Now we would like to ask first two persons, Anna, to provide a 10-minute summary of the world development special issues and its highlight, and then Rasmus will follow up with 10 minutes summary of the industrial and corporate change special issue. And then we will have some discussion among the team of 5 editors. And then we reserved at least 20 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So, and during the first hour, please make use of the chat function. So whatever questions you may have, so to make sure it doesn't get lost, just place it in the chat function, and Shaolan will at the end of the day moderate the final discussion and take into account all your insights and queries and questions from the chat. And please switch off your mics unless you're speaking, so we don't have any interference here. With this, over to Anna, please. Would you start with an overview of the world development special issue?
Many thanks, Tilman. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes, we see it.
Perfect. Okay. So, to give you an overview of the special issue and the reasons why we came up with the idea for the special issue, latecomer development in a greening world. First of all, we need to ask the question, is the world really greening? And we can see, we are of the opinion that yes, we do see something like a paradigm change. We see an increasing move from governments to subscribe, in particular to a low carbon narrative. So over 110 governments have by now subscribed to become climate neutral by 2050. And some of those governments really seem to mean it. They substantiated this pledge by Green Deals, for example, the EU. And also discussions started around measures such as carbon border adjustments to protect competitiveness in the countries or regions that really mean to become carbon neutral. And also we see increasing action by civil society. So increasing number of successful lawsuits against both governments, for example, recently Germany and the Netherlands, and enterprises, most recently Shell. And we also see a move from investors who are increasingly pushing their enterprises towards environmental protection. The Divest Invest initiative has been around for a while. Lately, we saw environmentally friendly votings from shareholders of Chevron and Exxon. So things are moving there as well. And also the international institutions are more and more buying into the low carbon narrative, the World Bank, the IMF, the IEA, and so on. What we also see is that other environmental dimensions than climate change are receiving less attention. For example, biodiversity, which of course also is a very dire issue, but so far there's not so much action yet. Nonetheless, we need to ask the question, how can developing countries, if we say this is a paradigm change, this is really something that will turn the world economy upside down, which strategy should developing countries really employ to pursue their economic catching up? Is it wise for them to green early, green now, and try to combine that with greening, with growing, sorry, and or is it wiser for them to wait a little until, for example, technologies have become cheaper, to grow first, concentrate on growing, and then cleaning up later? And we've tried to structure the evidence and the arguments along these lines. So looking at the pros for greening now, maybe also the arguments against greening now, and the arguments for cleaning up later. And I would like to start with the latter, because there can be arguments made for waiting a little. In the short run, at least, employment still exists in many sectors that are polluting. So if the countries want to retain that employment and protect the competitiveness of those industries, maybe even attract investments from countries where regulation is more stringent, then waiting with environmental regulation can be a strategy that, at least in the short run, works for higher growth rates. As I already mentioned, some green technologies are still in their early phases, and they are therefore more expensive. We saw a tremendous cost aggression, for example, in the renewable energies. So those countries that waited a little then had lower costs. And in the meantime, developing countries could prioritize other welfare enhancing investments. So that can also be a good strategy. And then the last argument that we thought of was greening might happen automatically once countries transition in their structural transformation away from industry and towards services. Obviously, there are also arguments for greening now. And among those, some are quite obvious, I would think. One of them is that we are facing environmental damage that at some point might become irreversible. So biodiversity once lost is not going to come back. Climate change once locked in is very difficult to reverse. And the longer we wait with restoring environmental equilibria, the more costly and the more difficult it may become. The second argument, the cost of switching pathways, it doesn't just apply to nature, that the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets to restore equilibria, but also to socio-technical pathways. The longer we lock in certain infrastructure, certain institutions, certain behaviors also, the more difficult it becomes to switch from those pathways to environmental protection. And then third, environmental protection or switching to greener technologies can also reduce the dependence on resource imports, for example, of fossil fuels, or also when we switch to circular economy, we need less primary resources, and thereby it can reduce economic volatility. Now, these arguments are pretty straightforward, but some arguments might be more challenging to justify. And therefore, we need evidence to see whether they actually hold. And we have received in our submissions mostly evidence for the greening now, our strategy. And so I would like to take you through the maybe less evident arguments for greening now, and also point out the contributions to our special issue that substantiate these claims with evidence. So greening now may actually lower environmental risk premiums in capital markets. Klingert in our special issue show that countries that are vulnerable to climate change impacts may face increased cost of debt and also restricted access to finance. And that holds both for countries and for individual firms. And this increased cost of debt and restricted access to finance, of course, hampers the development prospects of these countries and of these firms. So contributing to keeping those environmental damages as small as possible also safeguards the development prospects of these countries. Second, environmental fiscal reform can increase fiscal space, and this fiscal space can then be used, for example, for growth enhancing investments, or also for the social protection of those who might be negatively affected. And also, as Aman et al. In our special issue show, it can induce investments in efficiency and upgrading, and also other growth spurring investments. So Aman et al. Find for Oman that the removal of energy subsidies and the subsequent increase of energy prices in fact led to firm upgrading and efficiency increases. So this would support the so-called Porter hypothesis. Next, a strategy of proactive greening and early greening might also in some countries trigger early mover advantages and open up with these early mover advantages new employment opportunities. So for example, Zhang et al. In our special issues show that the establishment of eco-industrial parks in China improved not only the environmental performance, but also the competitiveness of these firms. And Altenburg et al., this article is still under review, we hope to include it soon, show that China's early investment in electric cars and buses, and also their related investment in the traction battery supply chain, increased competitiveness of the related industries. Now, coming to the international arena, countries that green early can also get preferential access to international green funds and also to international trade opportunities. For example, Brandi et al. Analyze preferential trade agreements and show that provisions in these trade agreements to liberalize trade in environmental goods and services can increase the green exports from developing countries, and in particular for those countries that are already positioned well. So a country that positions itself early in green technologies, in green goods and services, can then make better use of the increasing trend of environmental provisions in trade agreements. Greening now may also reduce the risk of asset stranding. Asset stranding has been in the discussion for a couple of years now, and Ansari and Holz actually find considerable risk of asset stranding in China for the coal sector in China, and also for the Middle Eastern and Latin American crude oil sectors. And this risks exist definitely for many countries, not just those analyzed, but any country that is strongly focused on fossil fuels or other highly polluting sectors is at risk of asset stranding. And then I think this is the last argument I'm going to make in favor of greening. The countries may make best use of their existing sustainable resources. Often there are resources in the countries, for example, renewable energies that are not yet really made use of. And Probst et al., for example, look at an international renewable energy investment support scheme, the Get Fit, and they show that it has spurred investment and investment on top of what would have happened without the investment scheme. And these investment decreased power outages in Uganda, so also enabled increases in firm productivity. And looking at different sectors, steel recycling, Netchefort et al. Show that China could potentially gain between 590 and 820 billion US dollar in GDP cumulated by 2030 by adopting steel scrap recycling practices. Now, what we have also seen through the contributions to our special issue is that these benefits do not accrue on their own. Policies matter, and the design of policies according to what we have in the country, the country context, is really key to be able to reap the opportunities of early greening and also to mitigate potential risks. So, for example, Lema et al. In the exploration of renewable energy projects in Africa conducted by Chinese investors find that these investments create economic benefits, but on a rather small scale. And these economic benefits could be increased by, for example, proactively including provisions for knowledge and capability transfer from the investing firms, by creating backward and forward linkages on the ground with local industries, and also by learning and building capacities in infrastructure development, which could then be also used beyond the domain of energy. For the case of Oman, Aman et al. Show that the firms will only invest in those performance improving investments if the fossil fuel subsidies are removed. They don't do it otherwise. And Etifor et al. Find that I gave this range of GDP gains that are possible, and the higher end of this range can only be reached if China really implements a comprehensive industrial policy mix aimed at improved recycling practices and also more adaptive downstream sectors. In the case of Zhang et al. On Chinese eco-industrial parks, we show that it was actually strong governmental support and also concrete accreditation standards that were key to the success. So again, a strong role of the government. Siddiqui et al. Show that municipal waste energy systems can be made self-sustaining. They analyze that for Karachi and Delhi, but only if accompanied by policies such as feed-in tariffs, payments for avoided pollution, high waste collection fees. And De Mello and Soleda show that international policy matters as well. They analyze the WTO negotiations, and they show the effects of differences between lists of environmental goods, and the differences have impacts on the trade opportunities of developing countries. So the shaping of international policies also matters. And so what I would like to conclude with is that what we think is a kind of mindset change to systematic co-design is needed in ministries. Currently, what we often find is that ministries of the environment often draft their environmental regulations without the needs of firms in mind, and those regulations might burden firms. And on the other hand, the ministries of trade and industry sometimes design industrial policies that treat the environment as an externality, and an externality that doesn't come at a cost. And so we think that in most cases, it would really be possible to design environmental policies that can pay off economically if from the beginning those policies are really designed to reap economic co-benefits. And also the economic policies could be designed to at least do no harm to the environment. And with the complete list of the contributions to our special issue, I would like to stop. We will make these slides available, so don't worry, and then you can access all of the contributions. Many thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for this excellent overview. I don't know, Roberta, would you like to come in with a question which you had originally planned, or should we move directly to Rasmus's presentation?
I suggest that we go to Rasmus directly.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So then Rasmus, over to you, please, for the second presentation. Thank you. You're still muted, Rasmus.
I'm just getting the PowerPoint ready. Okay, great to see so many distinguished audiences here, a lot of friends and colleagues. So I think it's really great that we could come together and present this special issue here. So Tilman has already given a very brief introduction to the special issue, and I will talk about the introduction, which brings together the different papers in the special issue. It's written by Xiaolang Fu, Roberta, and myself. But of course, the special issue brings together an effort which has evolved over a number of years, actually, and involving a large number of people. So we have 7 papers in the special issue, and most of these papers are written by teams consisting of researchers from Europe and different universities in Europe, and 2 universities in China. So the Chinese University of the Academy of Sciences and Tsinghua University. So that has been coordinated by the Sino-Danish Center for Education and Research. So basically, this team was started off with the big question, which is, what does the green transformation as a major techno-economic paradigm shift, what does that mean for catching up in the developing world? So these research questions here: is the green transformation opening new latecomer development opportunities? And what are the conditions and dynamics of green latecomer development? And do we need new conceptual frameworks to understand the determinants of change in green industry leadership? And basically, the answer to the last question here is yes. So we sought to put together a conceptual framework to structure our studies, to think about what the dynamics look like for latecomer development in the case of the green transformation. As it is very different, the dynamics was the hypothesis, are very different in green industries as compared to many other industries for catching up. So starting with the green transformation as a major megatrend, as an impact, looking at how that translates into new policy priorities, technological changes, and new markets. That translates into what we have called windows of opportunity. And windows of opportunity is a concept used a lot in the latecomer development and catching up literature. But of course, we wanted to understand what are the specificity of green windows, and can we sort of identify windows across institutional change windows, technological windows, and market windows. As such windows emerge, how can they be exploited? What are the conditions for their exploitation? So in terms of sectoral systems, what are the capabilities and preconditions and access? And depending on that, how that interplays with the green windows, how does that influence and result in different trajectories of latecomer development? Again, drawing on catching up literature and distinguishing between technological catching up on the one hand and market catching up on the other hand. I will come back to that. So we did a number of empirical studies. As was mentioned, we focused mainly on China, not entirely, but mainly on China, and we focused on renewable energy, so energy production technologies. And we looked at those that you can see on the right-hand side here, so biomass, concentrated solar power, hydropower, solar PV, and wind energy. And these are brought together in the case studies. Apart from some qualitative case studies, we also have some cross-cutting and comparative analysis using more quantitative methods. So I'm going to try to summarize very briefly some of the key findings. Oh, and of course, it's not easy to do within a 10 minutes time span, but I will try to do my best here. So first of all, what is clear is that there's a great deal of variety in the catching up trajectories at the sector level. So often green industries, they're thought about as a block, as a type of technologies. But actually, when you look deeper into that, you can see that the dynamics are very, very different for these different technologies. What we have on the right-hand side is an attempt to try to capture some of the broad stories about how these trajectories have evolved for each of these sectors. So I mentioned that we wanted to distinguish between catching up in markets and in technology. So when it comes to markets, we again distinguish between catching up in the domestic market and catching up in the global market, and looking at that from the perspective of market shares in domestic and global markets, respectively. In terms of the technologies I mentioned, we distinguish between new to the country technologies and new to the world technologies, and trying to assess the distance from the global frontier in terms of technological development. Also checking into account how the technological frontier is developing in terms of speed and directions. So what you can see on the figure here is that all of these technologies have taken different trajectories. Most of these technologies in China are now sort of working at the forefront on both dimensions. Not to the same extent, all of them, but nevertheless, one key conclusion, of course, is that in terms of catching up, what has been achieved in China in these industries is quite extraordinary. The pathways are slightly different in terms of how there has been interaction between global markets and local markets. Also in terms of the extent to which there has been a kind of a market route or a technology route in terms of catching up. And it's also clear that some of these sectors have not achieved the same degree of catching up as others. So, for instance, in the wind energy industry, as is shown here on the slide, that sector is still working mainly in the lower left quadrant. So in terms of the determinants, of course, what we find is that what we have called institutional windows are very, very important. In all of these sectors, institutional changes, perhaps not surprising for people who know these sectors in detail, but institutional changes have been key to catching up in all of them. And this is very different from, as I mentioned, catching up in many other sectors, where the type of windows, opportunity windows, tend to be much more dominated by technological change. So disruption caused in specific industries by shift from one standard to the other, for instance, create new opportunities for entrance. What we also find is that the sectoral characteristics and technological maturity is extremely important, and it goes a long way in explaining the variability that we see. So, for instance, one thing which is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive is that in most of the sectors that have been quite mature, where we have quite mature technologies, catching up has been the fastest, whereas in other sectors with more fast-moving technology frontiers, catching up is a bit more difficult. Also, what we find is that the exploitation of these green windows of opportunity is not automatic. It really depends on the action of firms and other institutions in the sectoral innovation system. And we also find that the kind of intervention mechanisms by policies and research institutes, business organizations, and so on, are quite different in the different sectors. In many cases, this has been quite successful, but of course also, as I mentioned, in the wind sector, there would need to be a kind of step change in order to break out of this situation there in the lower quadrant. So in terms of some of the key insights that we think we bring to the table, I think this coincides with what was also mentioned by Anna before. There can be important synergies between green transformation efforts and Latecomer catching up, but that does require a kind of co-design across environmental and technology and industrial policy domains. And this co-design cannot be blanket across different industries. As we have shown, the dynamics are very different depending on technology, and the support policies need to be specific to that. And we also find that this catching up has important implications for competition and collaboration in these sectors. And again, how that unfolds is very different from sector to sector. Then in terms of some implications and new questions, some of those I hope we can discuss a little bit later during the Q&A. So of course, one immediate and very important question is what we have witnessed and seen in China, can that be emulated elsewhere? Or how specific is the China case in this respect? Also, a more broader question is, the lessons that we have seen in green technologies as a kind of public good driven catching up story. Can we see similar stories? Can we find inspiration for what we call global challenge-led windows of opportunity in other industries, for example, in health? And of course, that discussion is very pertinent at the moment with COVID-19. And also lastly here, how different are the impacts of new and emerging technologies on green transformation in advanced and emerging economies? So thinking about the broad megatrend I was talking about as the green transformation, how does that intertwine and how is it impacted with other megatrends, the fourth industrial revolution, new digital technologies, and all of that. Also something that I hope we will come back to later. So here is an overview of the papers in the special issue. Many interesting papers there. If some of you have problems accessing the papers on the website, please get in touch and I will make sure to get them across. And apart from that, that's it for me now, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Rasmus, for a very, very nice overview and eye-opening insights, very interesting. So the idea was to have a little bit of discussion among the two teams of editors first, and then open up to the general audience, as I said in the beginning. Maybe just to kick off, it's very interesting to see how your research brings out the different technological trajectories, and I think the analytical framework is very, very interesting. And if I understand correctly, I mean, it's interesting, for example, this difference between solar PV and biomass, for example, where you see that the global technological leadership has been achieved by China, but not so much in wind turbines. And if I understand correctly, you said it depends on the speed of innovation and how rapidly the frontier moves. And the counterintuitive finding says that it's I mean, in a paradigm change situation, you would assume that the systems that change more quickly would be the ones where you can easily move in, right? But you say it's more the ones that are relatively mature where catching up happened. So maybe you can elaborate a bit on why that is the case, and maybe you didn't mention economies of scale. So this is of course unique in China. and whether economies of scale are a major part of the story there.
Yes, thank you, Tilman. So I think if we start with the counterintuitive point, then a lot of the literature is really showing that the greatest opportunities emerged in technologies or in sectors that has short technology cycles. So that creates more disruption and therefore also more space for new entrants to move in. And also that has greater disadvantages for incumbents where existing capabilities become obsolete much more quickly. But we didn't find this was the case in these sectors. And as you pointed out, a lot of this has to do with sort of the latecomer effect, you could call it. So when the technology is stable, when it's codified, when it's packaged, the opportunity to get access to that technology, bring it to China and scale it up, there was a much bigger potential for that. So for instance, you mentioned the biomass sector. A lot of the upgrading in that sector was really by acquiring foreign companies. A Danish company was very important for bringing the knowledge to China. And the Chinese government was very active in diffusing that knowledge from sort of the key acquiring companies to other firms in the sector through research institutes. So there's this catch-up effect where you can get access to technology easier and develop in that way. Of course, now in the biomass sector, these firms are operating across the globe, but not least in Southeast Asia. And I think really benefiting from excellence in terms of organizing, Chinese capacity for organizing these biomass plants through existing designs. So there's also something to do with organizational capabilities. And I think the same is a bit the case in solar PV, where technology is quite standardized, almost commodified. So getting access to that technology meant that Chinese firms could exactly focus on economies of scale and also process innovations for bringing the prices down. And then lastly, for the wind turbine sector, the reason why catching up was so difficult there was, as you mentioned, because the technology frontier was moving. So competition is not really determined by whether you can produce a turbine, design and produce a turbine, but competition has moved elsewhere. First, of course, in terms of applying the turbines in the offshore segment, but now it has much more to do with sort of smart management of wind farms and integration of that electricity into the grid. And this is where the Chinese still are struggling a little bit, but where a lot of incumbent firms have kind of home market advantages because of quite advanced electricity systems and high standards. So that was an elaborate answer.
Okay, so maybe I can come in with a question for Tilman and Anna. I mean, I think that one very interesting aspect that you are addressing in your special issue is the distributional impact of adopting an early greening model. Because, I mean, in your introduction, you conclude that latecomers can reap gains from early greening, but it's not very clear who is going to gain more from it. So my question is, I mean, within countries for whom early greening is going to be more convenient, who is really going to gain and who is going to lose? And also, I think that in terms of industries, probably there will be industry gaining more and other maybe losing. Also in terms of jobs, I would say, what, according to you, are the types of jobs which will be created and which jobs will be lost? I think that, I mean, you provide some evidence about this, and I think it will be interesting if you could elaborate a little bit more on this aspect. I don't know if Tillman or Anne would like to come in.
Maybe I can start, and then Anna, you can add if you want. I think this question about winners and losers is very important because the transition is never smooth, and structural transformation always creates losers, and that political acceptability depends on the distribution between winners and losers and the ways we manage to compensate also those who are potential losers, right? I think the first statements we all need to be very clear of is if we continue with business as usual, we will all lose, right? So that's, I mean, first the first very obvious statement, and that means there's little alternative to moving towards greener economies. That said, I think most of all the vulnerable will be suffering from business as usual, both in terms of countries and populations and firms. This applies obviously to direct environmental impacts, where we can clearly see that countries in the global south will severe the hardest damages. But it also applies to secondary economic impacts, like the paper by Kling et al. That we have in the World Development Special issue, which Anna mentioned, that shows that vulnerability to climate change increases the risk, the risk premium on loans, right, and thereby restricts access to finance for both countries and individual firms. So they are punished twice, no, by the climate change for which they have not contributed. Firstly, they suffer the direct consequences, and then even negative economic impacts. But then, of course, we need to differentiate by sectors, and greening means that we have a deliberate policy-induced structural transformation. So from polluting industries to clean industries, and it's a transformation we want, no? And in transformation, there's always a loser, and we essentially want certain polluting industries to be fundamentally redesigned or phased out, no? Such as coal and oil-related industries and combustion engines and all this. And all these transformations within each sectors will have winners and losers within countries and across countries. I mean, the Nietzsche et al. Papers shows that iron ore exporters would be negatively affected by increased steel recycling in China. Countries like Brazil, for example, were exporting steel to China, but China itself could benefit. So I think we have this kind of distribution of pros and cons, and we need to look into the micro situation of each sector to see this. But what is clear in terms of policies is that firstly, the countries that act proactively and are among the earlier movers will be in a more favorable starting position. And secondly, there need to be solutions for the people in those sectors that necessarily will decline, such as coal workers, in terms of retraining and regional innovation programs, or entire economies like Nigeria and Angola who will suffer from asset stranding. There need to be major programs also for restructuring the economies, where we can learn a lot from the traditional coal mining industries in the US or Germany or Britain or so, which have gone through that 50 years earlier.
Tillman, sorry, can I follow up a question?
Yes, please.
I think it's a very important finding about moving, better to move early. So this benefits from to the early movers, in addition to some efficiency gains and also kind of a clear up of the pollutions. how about the innovation rents that accrued to the first movers? So if this is also a very important part, so then what is the role played by the intellectual property protection? And if this is a very important part to guarantee, to ensure the gains for the early movers, then does this pose any barriers to diffusion? So what are the findings? Do you have any findings from the special issue on this?
I'm not sure whether from this special issue we have findings, but I think firstly it's important to distinguish the type of benefits. I think we have found lots of benefits in terms of access to credit conditions, in terms of immediate gains, in terms of energy efficiency improvement and job creation, as, for example, labor becomes cheaper relative to fossil fuel resources. That benefits labor-rich countries and low labor cost countries, etc. But these are not related to innovation rents. So I think we find lots of potential advantages in developing countries that are immediate, but innovation rents will probably be something that will accrue to richer countries also in the future. We see that the OECD countries and importantly China, I think, no? Which is currently reaping a lot of starting to reap the innovation rents, and you know more about that, Charlene, than I do. But I think we need to make that distinction. And what's the role of intellectual property rights in this? I think this is an important point about the green transformation, that we are dealing with global public goods. We have the same things that we are currently discussing with the vaccines, no? Where we have a global unjust situation, and we need to rethink the intellectual property rights regimes to make sure that the biotechs and Pfizer's and so on don't keep all the innovation rents, and poor countries don't get access to COVID-19 vaccines. No? So we have these discussions, and that also applies for green innovation, I would say, because you have many things like energy storage technologies, second generation biomass technologies, carbon capture and storage technologies, green hydrogens, things that we know are essential parts of a greener transformation, but we don't yet have all the technologies. So I think we need something like internationally orchestrated and co-funded technology missions to deal with these public goods. And then, of course, find rules to gain access to this. And I don't know, maybe later on I saw Helene de Koning in the audience. Maybe when we open up later on, would be nice also to hear your views, because you have worked a lot on the UNFCCC technology mechanism, things like that.
Thank you.
Whether anyone wants to add, please, over to the others.
Yes, maybe I can complement a little. The comparison between green technologies and health technologies is not always so easy, because in the health sector, especially when it comes to medicine, there are often a limited number of patents involved. Whereas if we look at renewable energies, for example, there are a lot more patents involved, and the technologies are a lot more, let's say, complicated in that sense. And so I don't want to say that technology transfer and intellectual property regimes do not play a role. They certainly do, but it is more complex in the green technologies. And second, let's not forget that innovation rents are not the only rents that can be captured. As Rasmus rightly said, sometimes it can be a good strategy to wait until a technology really is mature enough so that we know what the standards are, and that what we call in German Kinderkrankheiten, the childhood illnesses of the technology, have been overcome. And there's a kind of common pathway for their technology agreed among global players, and then get into the business, let's say.
can I just follow up with a question on the innovation rents? Because you make a very forceful argument with all this evidence for co-benefits. But I think, I mean, many of these co-benefits you talk about are automatic. So if you deploy a lot of renewable energy, automatically you decrease your dependency on oil imports, for instance. So that's almost automatic. But of course, innovation rents and a lot of those economic co-benefits around that in terms of job creation and business development, they are not automatic at all. So what does that mean? Are we supposed to just accept that there are some countries that will gain these innovation rents? There are others where there are much fewer incentives for engaging in the green transformation. And also, what does that mean for international policy?
Who would like to answer?
So maybe I just share some preliminary thoughts on this. I think we face global challenges, not only health, the pandemic, not only climate change, but also like poverty reduction, hunger, etc. So these are the sectors really relate to the basic needs of human being, and also a challenge that will have a wider implication and also moral implication too. I think what I know is there are discussions on the reforms of the IP regime that some of the opinions is that we should distinguish the different areas of technology. For the technology related to the green transformation, relate to the vaccine pandemic, relate to basic food security, water security, etc. We should have a different IP regime and encourage the diffusion, either through public policy support the poor countries to get a license to use it, or use public policy to support the basic research, and therefore a relatively loose regime for IP protection and encourage the diffusion, facilitate the diffusion. And also we can distinguish different countries too. So as Tillman also just mentioned, need some changes, reforms in the global technology governance to facilitate this. But like, I think different sectors also different. Some sectors, the IP, the patent is not enough. Like for vaccine, patent needs support by a lot of tacit knowledge in production, in management, in global value chain coordination. And this tacit knowledge, even you waive the IP, the multinationals may not transfer. And this also, I'm thinking seriously, we need some mechanism to encourage, incentivize, and engage with the private sector to transfer and share this tacit knowledge together with this reformed IP regime to allow the global diffusion and adoption, like, you know, in green technology, in health, production capacity, etc. So this just some preliminary thoughts on this.
Very good. And I think I've been reading the chat. I mean, it's a bit difficult to jump forth and back between the question and the chat, but I think we have very relevant comments here in the chat also on the technology sharing mechanisms that we have available. So I think this is a very relevant topic, definitely to think not so much in terms of national industrial policies and innovation systems, but in terms of global arrangements. I don't know, Rasmus, did you still have questions that you feel have not been answered? Could you?
No, I mean, my question was in your research on the co-benefits, and just noting the fact that some co-benefits are more automatic than others. What position does that put us in terms of acknowledgement that some co-benefits are likely to only emerge in some countries, and that will create much less incentive for at least for the poorest countries to engage in the green transformation?
Okay, I think obviously we need to distinguish between the various types of advantages that countries have, and I think that it would not be very honest to assume that many developing countries with weak institutions and very low R&D budgets would be able to reap innovation rents in complex green technologies like the ones that you described in your presentation. Of course, then there are innovations that can be that where the entry barriers are fairly low. And we did a study for the German standards agency PTB, where we listed kind of low entry barrier technologies that are interesting for technological innovation in developing countries, from drip irrigation systems to all sorts of biomass related innovations, etc., where you don't need sophisticated innovation systems. No? And of course, ecotourism and things like that could be create new competitive advantages with countries, even if they don't have very complex institutions and innovation systems. But I think in most cases, probably the gains for the poorer countries are in energy efficiency gains, in opportunities related to the labor demand of recycling industries, in green hydrogen, for example. I mean, obviously, if the big economies the plan of the big economies to be fueled by transportable and storable renewable energies from countries that are rich in solar radiation, wind resources, geothermal resources, etc., and then make them to convert them into green hydrogen and then fuel the green transformation in the EU and the US with those imported things. And that creates, of course, potential technological trajectories for countries that are rich in solar radiation, that kind of things. So there are this kinds of competitive advantages, but I think they are not primarily related to innovation rents. So I think, as in all sorts of industrial policy, countries need to find their own ways to exploit the opportunities of a paradigm change, and they will be very, very different.
I would have a question that kind of nicely links up with that to you, Rasmus, Roberta, and Scalan. Now, always speaking of different capacities and different contexts of the countries to reap certain advantages. And then we see your special issue on China. The question, of course, comes up whether that example is really something that only China could have accomplished. With its huge domestic market, with also maybe the possibility to implement policies quickly, also combined with a relatively high technological capability. So this is really helpful to gain a foothold in global markets. And what can other countries that are smaller, countries that are less technologically advanced, that don't have maybe such deep pockets also, what can these countries learn from your evidence, and where do they also have to employ other strategies? But also, speaking as a German, what can Germany learn? I'm sure that there are also lessons that more industrially advanced countries can still learn.
Rasmus, would you like to go first?
Okay, if you want, I can answer. I mean, I think yes, you are right. It's obvious, but China is a very unique case, and we, in our special issue, indeed, we have focused on China. But I think there are a few lessons which are relevant both for emerging countries as well as for advanced countries, such as the EU countries. I think the first key lesson is what Rasmus was mentioning about the fact that green windows of opportunities are endogenous. And this implies that they can be created by government, and they can be influenced by domestic and global environmental and industrial policies. And I think a very good example is the Green Deal driving the Next Generation EU plan in this moment. This is a clear example of a green windows of opportunity for EU countries. And I think the second message that it applies to every country is the fact that the exploitation of these green windows of opportunity cannot be taken for given. It's not automatic. You need actions at level of firms and at levels of other private and public actors in sectoral systems. This action will influence whether and how these potential opportunities are going to be translated into reality. And just to make a concrete example of how green windows of opportunity could work also in other emerging countries, I would like to refer to the case of Vietnam. I was recently involved in an OECD mission in Vietnam, and I could clearly experiment the unbelievable congestion of motorcycles in Hanoi. So I think that there, for instance, clearly there is an opportunity for the country, because Vietnam has a very good capability in terms of manufacturing and assembly capacity. But if the government will intervene and change the focus from building up manufacturing capacity to developing, for instance, an integrated mobility chain with more attention to the environmental impact, to electrical motorcycles and minibuses, for instance. This will not only generate new manufacturing opportunities, but will open also new spaces in services related to, for instance, the management for transport intelligence systems and so on. So I think that notwithstanding, I mean, we should recognize the specificity and uniqueness of China. There is a lot which can be learned by other countries too. And I think that not only our special issue, also your special issues are clearly pointing at this direction.
Yeah, I fully agree with Roberta, and also would like to add a few. I think Anna asked a very important question, and also the characteristics that you have summarized about China's large market, the ability to quick implementation, and also the technological capability are really a very good summary. However, I think the implications for other countries is that, like for some small countries, to think about openness and the regional integration. China's innovation and the fast growth definitely benefit from the large market, and especially it's a large country with significant regional disparity. So there are different segment markets, and allow the firms to upgrade, within the country, but in different segment markets. And so this is benefits. However, for other countries, regional integration, including not only EU, but also, African regional integration will be, a way to think about that. Among the developing countries or the BRICS countries, China's trade to GDP ratio is about 40%. So it's very high, and China really benefits both domestic and international markets. So I think that is one. And also China's local government are very active in the growth of the renewable energy in the green technology sector. And very often, like the size of China's regions for provinces could be, similar to the size to many of the small countries too. So actually, the local government's agency in creating and seizing the opportunity windows and capture it, through their initiatives. I think this is also, like Roberta mentioned, the government's agency and the institutional change is also very important. That could be something relevant to other countries. For large countries like Germany, I think overall, Germany is doing very well. I don't think I have very strong, recommendations for Germany. But if anything, implications is that for European countries in general, there is still a role of industrial policies. Of course, is well designed and competition neutral industrial policies avoids the pitfalls that, China has learned, but also learned some of the experiences that work. I think there is a role of industrial policy to developing the production capability, not to say the innovation, frontier innovation, but the production capacity. There is a role of the state. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have, I've seen that we have a lot of expertise in the audience. And I think we should open up now. And I saw so many interesting comments. So who would like to come in with comments? Or I think, Charlan, if you want to take over the moderation here.
Yeah, thank you, Tillman. Yeah, I have collected and copy-pasted on a document. The first question is to Rasmus and Roberta. In terms of the lowering of the costs of social or technical transition towards eco-friendly solution in our value chains, what would the key determinants, social as income inequality or primarily technological or deterministic trajectories based on economies of scale, efficiencies? Currently, environmental upgrading is not hardwired into production and process of manufacture, and thus incorporation of sustainability into economic upgrading is problematic. So that's the first question. For Rasmus and Roberta.
Rasmus, I leave it to you.
What would be the key determinants, social or primary technological trajectories?
Let's collect a few questions. And I think also Simon Maxwell has been eagerly waiting to ask a question.
Okay, I will read through following the sequence. There is also a good comment on Tillman's talk and a good conclusion on co-design. That's what we call climate compatible development planning. So this is one comment related to the world development conclusion, but also I think the ICC special issue also, I think, co-design of the policies. It's also one of the main findings. The third question is question for Rasmus. Wind, solar PV, and hydro have potentials for catching up. Do you envisage same or different scenarios in Africa are available for research collaboration? So that's the third question.
challenge. Should we maybe allow some live questions, and then
yeah, good.
can, at the end of the day, wrap up and try to answer as many of the questions as we can in the remaining time?
Yeah. So I see Simon.
Make it more interactive.
Okay. I see a hand raised by Simon.
Hi, thanks very much. I love this stuff. I think it's really interesting. But I have two problems and a suggested reframing. I find this distinction between using a technology, producing it, and using it and producing it quite problematic. You know, I have a smartphone, but nobody in the UK makes smartphones as far as I know. So how do you distinguish between those two? But I find the framing of sort of wait a bit quite problematic. You know, what we know is that we have to cut emissions by half by 2030. We have to reduce emissions to zero by 2050. So nobody is off the hook, and countries are required to produce new nationally determined contributions this year. Everybody has to commit to net zero. Everybody has to be on that trajectory. And the question is, what will be in those NDCs and conditional NDCs as regards technology? And I think you have the opportunity in this work to kind of turn the subject on its head and to say, if there is going to be a serious commitment to net zero by 2050 and to 1.5 trajectories by 1.5 by 2030, then this is what we need to do in terms of technology transfer. And I think you've got a manifesto hidden in this set of papers that could be translated into something really attractive for the COP in Glasgow later this year. And I just wonder whether that elicits any thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I think this is a very important comment. Thank you. Technology transfer is so important for this green transformation, and also your suggestion about this hidden kind of agenda that we can propose to the COP26 is really also very important. So I wonder whether I can add one more question for Anna and Tilman, and then 5 questions together, maybe as the first cohort of questions for our editors to answer. So another question for Anna and Tilman is, most advanced economies are following a clean up later strategy. In Denmark, it is called hockey stick, awaiting proven technology and dominant design. Do you have good examples of developing countries following the green now strategy, and by that establish a position as path creators in new regime? So this is a question for Anna and Tilman. These 5 questions, I think our editors can, maybe you can pick up some 1 or 2 questions that you would like to respond, each of you. Who would like to start?
So if you want, I can start about this question about using technologies and producing them. I think that, I mean, this is a question which has been widely investigated in the literature, not only in this kind of technologies. At least for the empirical evidence we have been collecting, we have tried to find evidence of this shift from using to producing technologies. And a case could be the hydro industry in China, where at the beginning clearly was a matter of using imported technology, but after, I mean, for a number of reasons, among which there is also the fact that developed countries have went out from this industry. But now, for instance, if you look at the patenting globally in this specific industry, China is really at the core of the network. So most of the patents come from China. So, I mean, this is a clear sign that China has moved from using imported technology to producing new technologies. And in this particular industry, China has been the main actor of greening this industry. So, and of course, this is different from industry to industry. You can find a similar pattern in solar PV, and as it was explained before by Rasmus, this is not the case in wind. So it really depends also on some specificity of the technologies. I mean, what we have found is that more mature and more tradable technologies are the one in which, for China, has been easier to reach the frontier and to, for instance, to start patenting and so on.
And thank you, Roberta. And Anna, would you like to come in? Yeah.
Thanks a lot. So also answering to Simon, you said every country has to become carbon neutral by 2050. And obviously that is the environmental imperative that we're facing. And I very much subscribe to that, but not everyone does. And so the approach that we take in our special issue is explicitly asking, so if they do pursue an early greening strategy, a greening now strategy, what's in it for them, right? How can that be made economically beneficial to also be able to convince the people who do not subscribe to the environmental imperative, right? To people who think, well, why would we? We didn't cause the problem, so why would we now embark on a pathway that might harm us economically, right? And so we also need to get these people on board, because very often these people are the ones who take decisions in the treasuries, in the economic ministries, in the ministries of trade and industry. So we need to get these people on board. And so this is why I would very much support the pledge for technology transfer, for example, for building technological capacities in all of the countries. But we also look at the economic benefits, for example, that do come from using the technologies. So the case studies that are concerned with investments in renewable energies, for example, in our special issue. They don't just look at can the countries in the end produce those technologies themselves. This is maybe not even something that we should strive for, because we do have competitive advantages in different countries. And so some countries can produce the technologies cheaper, right? I mean, we kind of all benefited from China getting into renewable energies and producing those technologies at scale. So they are cheap now. If it were still Germany would produce these technologies, then we would face much higher costs. And so we look at the broad range of benefits that can come from embarking on a pathway to greening, and try to use that material to also be able to convince people who do not believe that greening is an imperative per se.
Thank you, Anna. And Rasmus, you may have something to add or choose different questions to answer. Yeah.
Well, it's an answer to Simon, and also to one of the questions in the chat that you read out about Africa. So it's about this distinction between using and producing. And I think for the case of phones that you mentioned, Simon, the difference, and I'm thinking here about mobile phones, is that mobile phones, they have a lot of knock-on effects in terms of economic opportunities, welfare enhancements, and so on. I think, and I'm now talking from the perspective of sustainable energy, there are not really a lot of dynamic effects from introduction of sustainable energy. And therefore, the importance of being part of what is being produced is so important to having co-benefits. And here I think, I mean, in terms of this question from the African perspective, it's very clear that there's a huge potential for solar PV across the African continent, but basically it's impossible to compete with the Chinese in production of solar PV panels. So how can you somehow gain access to some of these economic co-benefits? And I think it's not so much about the production of the PV panels themselves, but it's about thinking about, okay, as users of these technologies, how can we gain a little bit of a foothold in the entire value chain? And here it's about thinking, can we develop capabilities for project development? Can we develop capabilities for producing some of these other components that go into solar power projects, so rackings and inverters and all the cablings, and get access to that? Because I think a lot of, when we talk about co-benefits, the argument of having just access to operation and maintenance parts, I think that has been oversold. And this is something that comes out of the research I did that Anna mentioned, that if you really want to have significant economic co-benefits, you need to be a part of not just the maintenance of this infrastructure, but of the production of it. And again, you can't produce the core technologies, but you can produce and maintain and service a lot of the things that are around that.
Thank you, Rasmus. And Tilman.
Well, thank you very much. There are so many interesting questions in the chat, and I would like to continue for 3 hours. Let me just pick a few. One question was there about if even Denmark goes for polluting first and then cleaning up later, what are the prospects for developing countries, and are there any? And I think that we don't have any country that entirely greens first and is on track with a 2050 zero carbon agenda. So it's relative to others, I would say, and there we do see quite a lot of strategic choices. And for example, if you look at electric mobility, and Roberta talked about urban air pollution in Hanoi. China took the decision very early to electrify its bus fleets, but Latin American countries did not. And now the big bus corporations, BYD, Yutong, and so on, are exporting electric buses to all over the world, to Germany, and Colombia just bought, I think, more than 1,000 e-buses from China and things like that. So clearly, this shows that one country has taken a relatively green first strategy and clearly benefited in terms of competitive advantage. Another example is India's solar mission, which I find very impressive, because at the time the solar mission started, the price of solar energy was so much more expensive than coal, and there was such a deficit in supply in India that everybody said they are crazy now to formulate ambitious targets for creating solar industries, and they have been super successful. But they've been successful also, and this again is a question of whether to produce or to buy. They had a local content requirements for producing solar PVs, and that part of the story failed because it makes sense to compete against China. So the key strategic decision to be made was, do we want to green our energy system quickly and then import the technology, or do we want to produce everything locally and then delay the transition of the energy systems? In that case, clearly, I would say industrial policy would not be the right answer to say we need to do everything at home. So I think it's very context specific. And one final thing I would like to pick up is very important, which we haven't really addressed, is on the question that refers to rebound effects. No? So there was a question about, even if we advance very quickly on green technologies, there will still be growing consumption and growing footprints So we need to think more about demand side management, circular economy, etc. I think this is something we need to think much more about, and it's tricky because, for example, if the EU has a very ambitious circular economy plan now, what does it mean? It means that we don't import from developing countries mineral resources, for example, and what then remains as growth prospects for countries that have emerged through global value chains. I mean, these are big questions that we still need to answer. I don't have a good answer to that, but I think we are making progress with the special issues that we produce and the expertise of all the people here in the room. But I see hundreds of research questions that need to be still resolved.
Thank you, Tilman. Am I right? We have another half an hour to finish.
Rasmus, sorry, Shalan, we plan to finish now.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Then it's great that the workshop today has stimulated so many interesting questions. I think at least another 10 questions I was going to collect every 5 in 2 slots. So obviously, this means this is a very important question, a topic that has attracted wide attention, and also still a lot of new questions coming up. But this 2 special issue has, through in-depth studies in different countries, either compared different sectors in one country, or look at different sectors and also in different countries. And there are also useful, I think, insightful findings offered to us. Is that first, there is green windows of opportunity for the latecomer countries. So that is one. And number 2 is that there are various benefits for green now, and most of the countries find green now is a better strategy in comparison to clean up later. Despite there is no country definitely strictly follow the green now strategy, because those with the capacity to really go green have already developed, but the lessons that we learned from the past and also from the country's practice now is that green now is a better strategy. However, we found the sector specific characteristics and also the characteristics of the technology development in the sector really make a significant impact. And the different countries also have different geographical, technological conditions. And therefore, I think these 2 special issues speak to each other, is that different countries should develop the green technology that it has the comparative advantage, which match the characteristic of the technology and also the conditions, factor condition, geo condition of the country, so that develop the sector, not all the sector, but choose a sector it has the comparative advantage. And both special issue also find institutional change and government policy play a very important role in initiating the green windows opportunity and the catch up. And so the agencies of the governments at various levels, central level, local level, are critical, and also their capacity to catch up the windows of opportunity is also very important. I think these are very important lessons learned from these special issues, the many papers and the work by so many authors, so many researchers across the globe. Thank you. And I wonder whether Tilman or Roberta, Rasmus, you have more to add, and Anna, to the conclusion, to the concluding remarks.
Well, I think we can just leave it here, and thank you, Shalan, for your conclusion, and thank you everybody for participating. It was I think a very successful and interesting for us. So we have many questions to think about for the future. And please get in touch if you feel you would like to I mean, to discuss and to know more about the special issues. Thank you again.
And we will be in touch with a follow-up email with all the information, presentations, and so on. Thank you.
And there are so many interesting questions in the chat that we didn't get to. So
yeah, but
some of us will try to answer those via Twitter when we can.
Yeah,
oh, sure.
we
That's a
can.
great idea.
I will share the chat with all of you. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I would also second what Roberta said. For those, all these interesting questions, just get in touch and let's continue discussing and exchanging emails. And Simon's idea to write he write, let me know when you have written a COP26 technology transfer manifesto. I think that will be tomorrow, but
yeah, I would like
these
to
are excellent
you.
ideas, and I would like to really follow up on these things with everyone interested.
Yes, I think it's a wonderful idea, really important.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, you,
everyone.
Hubert as our special guest.
Have a nice evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.